Podcasts on UNC-TV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.
Just as the Civil War ended in Chapel Hill, the university president's daughter fell in love with the Yankee general occupying the town. The town went crazy. What happened to this couple? We'll find out when we talk to the couple's great-great-granddaughter, Suzy Barile, who is the author of Undaunted Heart, the true story of a Southern belle and a Yankee general. We'll do all that on North Carolina Bookwatch next.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Welcome to North Carolina Bookwatch. I'm V.G. Martin, and my guest is Suzy Barile, who's the author of Undaunted Heart, the true story of a Southern belle and a Yankee general. Suzy Barile, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, I'm really thrilled to have you. I'm excited about this book. Coincidentally, we're right here in Swain Hall on the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill campus, and this building's named for David Swain, your ancestor, your great-great-great-great.
Three greats.
Three great-great-great-great-grandfather. Swain County's named for David Swain. And the story starts with David Swain and his daughter.
It does. Starts with him participating in the surrender of the city of Raleigh and asking the Yankee soldiers not to pillage the university. And then the Yankee leader in charge of those soldiers calling on him and meeting his daughter.
Wow. All right, well, let's talk about the, want to talk first about the Yankee general?
Sure.
We start out, this is General Atkins.
Smith Dykins Atkins, named for his uncle, his mother's brother.
And we should say that General Atkins was a part of Sherman's army as it marched out of South Carolina into North Carolina.
Serving with General Kilpatrick, who was referred to as Kill Cavalry by his men, because he didn't mind killing whoever he needed to.
Lots of stories, memory more about Kilpatrick in North Carolina than Sherman, really, as sort of the evil villain.
I think so, yes.
And so General Atkins, your ancestor, was a part of that group, but not a part of it in a way.
He led his own brigade. They were mounted, and they went ahead and checked to see if there was enemy out there. They followed behind sometimes as a follow-up, and so he reported to Kilpatrick, but he also was a leader of his own men in his own right.
Well, tell us this story is sort of a legend in Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
And why is it held on as something to talk about for 150 years?
I think because it was the end of the Civil War. People hadn't even had time to get used to the fact that the war was over, that the South was no longer the Confederacy, that they were going back to being part of the United States of America. And suddenly one of their own falls in love with this Yankee general, and he's wooing her, and the soldiers are serenading at her home, and she's getting all dressed up and putting flowers in her hair, waiting for him to call. And it was just so scandalous that she would even think that that was okay.
Well, it all started out well enough. Tell us the story of when President Swain's daughter first met General Atkins. How did that, set that up for us? And it looked like she would react appropriately to the conquering general.
Well, it did. There's several different versions of exactly what happened, but the bottom line is that she was just like any other young woman in town, curious about the Yankees, but she wasn't going to give in to them. maybe the soldiers and the Confederacy had folded, but the women had not. So her father called for someone to bring him a book that he was going to.
So now General Atkins had come to call
sorry,
on
yes.
the.
General Atkins had come to call on Davis Swain to say, we're here in town, we're supposed to be protecting the university, and I just want you to know that we're going to do that. The two men were talking about history, so the story goes, instead of talking about the reasons for the war. Both of them were history buffs, and so Davis Swain said, I want to show you a book I have about the Revolutionary War, and I envisioned him standing in the doorway of his library and calling out for someone to bring it. And the someone who brought it was his daughter Ella, 22 years old, pretty girl from her photographs and what people say. And she marched in with her nose up in the air because she was going to not give any notice to this Yankee. But when her father had to introduce them and she looked at him, so the story goes, they changed eyes and a wooing followed.
So here she came, the dutiful Confederate sympathizer or supporter. Here's the conquering general. Her father demands that she brings the book. She's going to do this, but she's not going to give any improper attention to the conqueror.
No, she's not going to notice him at all. Both of them had blue eyes.
And then this is over.
Yeah, and that was it. From that moment on, he was calling on her, and she seemed to offer no resistance based on the recordings of what happened back then.
Well, how did the townspeople react to this? These are the white Chapel Hillians who had supported the Confederacy and now are being occupied, not by choice, but because they're conquered people.
And they were really occupied because the soldiers were staying in their homes. So it wasn't like these soldiers were camping out in the streets. Some of them were, but the higher ranking officers were staying in the homes of the Chapel Hill residents. And so they had to be polite to them, but they didn't necessarily have to accept what had happened. All the young girls, though, I try to put myself in their place, 22 years old, there haven't been any boys around in a while, and suddenly here's these young men, and the girls were probably a little bit flirty, and the young men hadn't seen any cute girls in a while, and they were probably a little bit flirty, and the older residents of town were horrified that this was happening, more horrified that it would be the university president's daughter, and that's how they expressed their concern, was just writing and saying how scandalous this was, that this would take place.
Well, what happened? What happened to this courtship?
Well, what happened to the courtship was about 3 weeks later, when Atkins and his soldiers marched out of Chapel Hill, Ella told her parents that she'd become engaged. And her father, Davis Swain, had not been a supporter of secession in the beginning and only gave into it when it appeared certain that whether he supported it or not, it was going to happen. So he went along with it and he supported his home state, but now that the war was over, it was time to move on. Business as usual. The university had stayed open, but its enrollment had dropped tremendously, just a dozen students when the fall semester began in 1864. He was ready to move forward. And his wife, however, was not quite so happy about it. She had refused to come down and eat at the dinner table when President Swain had invited General Atkins to eat in their home. So Ella told her parents she was engaged.
Well, now this is interesting. So there was a difference of viewpoints in the family, and it's maybe explainable because of the backgrounds of the two parents. David Swain came from the mountains. He was a very important North Carolina figure, having been governor and then president of the university, maybe the only person to hold those offices that we know of in North Carolina. But Ella's mother, David Swain's wife, had a longer line of important political connection. She was in the eastern part of North Carolina.
Yes.
Tell us about her.
She was the granddaughter of Richard Caswell, who was the state's first governor after Revolution was declared in 1776. He came in as the first governor, and he had fought in the Revolutionary War. Her father had been a young soldier. William White had been a young soldier in the war, and her father had also been Secretary of State. William White had been Secretary of State, and so Mrs. Swain had grown up in Raleigh.
She was the granddaughter of a governor, the wife of a governor,
and the daughter of a Secretary of State, and so Now, despite the fact that her father died when she was about 11, her mother, as the daughter of a governor, maintained her social status in town. And so I'm not saying that they were feted all the time, but she had some status in terms of the family that she came from.
Sometimes we talk about old Raleigh today. This was really old Raleigh.
It was old Raleigh. And her brother, and when she married David Swain, she married into the Joel Lane family, and he was the one who had laid out the city of Raleigh. So she had a lot of those historical ancestral connections.
One of the, I hate to jump around like this, but talking about Mrs. Swain, one of the most compelling parts of the story that you tell in your book is the reaction of Mrs. Swain to the engagement and the wedding, and then to the development of the family afterwards. So can you sort of tell the story of the wedding and the future of the family through Mrs. Swain's eyes?
Sure. Her husband reportedly went up to Freeport, Illinois, where this young soldier was from, and found out that he was an okay guy, that he had a job waiting for him, that he'd been a state's attorney general before the war, and so he came back fairly well satisfied. Mrs. Swain, I think, sort of said, okay, if this is what has to happen, this is what has to happen. And the wedding moved on. There's not a whole lot about her and what she had to say, except when she finally began visiting the family. Now, Ella wrote letters back and forth to her parents when she got married, and nearly every letter calls on her mother to please like her husband. Not in so many words, but General wrote you a letter, why haven't you written back? General sends his love just like I do. Oh, he's such a good man. I married such a good man. A year after they married, Mrs. Swain did write a poem about the fact that the war was over, the southern states were going to have to come back into the Union. She was going to have to show her allegiance to the flag that she had once showed her allegiance to, and she dedicated it to him. But she had refused to come to dinner that night when General Atkins had been invited to the Swain table. And
this was
at the end of the war, when the soldiers were first occupying Chapel Hill.
Refused to eat with him.
And she continued that through her daughter's entire marriage.
Now this is just unbelievable to me. This is the mother-in-law.
Now
we know about these conflicts. Help me with this.
Okay.
Because we know about the in-law conflicts and how some mothers don't think that the husbands are ever good enough for their daughters, right, and shun them or punish them in different ways. The irony for me, if I got this right, is that Mrs. Swain really came to be devoted to
yes.
General Atkins and to respect him. He was a dutiful son-in-law. But if I got it right, did she refuse to eat with him forever just because he was a Yankee general?
I say, when I speak to audiences, I say, now how many of y'all are Southern women? And everybody, eagerly raises a hand. And then I said, do you back down from anything? No, no. So Mrs. Swain had made this proclamation. She was not going to sit at the dinner table with the Yankee general. And she maintained that stance through the entire marriage. Whenever she visited in their home in Illinois, or when they visited in her home in Raleigh, the general carried her dinner up to her as she sat in her room, and he sat with her. I can imagine the conversations that took place. And that's the story I grew up hearing, that this is what happened. The story got passed down from my great-grandmother to her daughter to my mother to me, that she never, ever sat at the dinner table with him.
Well, just to make the point, if this story is true, and we think it is, we're not positive that it's true, but we think it is, that she held to her loyal convictions all the while as she became more and more devoted and dependent on her son-in-law for support. If I got that right?
Yes, and in fact, when she died in 1883, General Atkins was the executor of her estate. So she was more and more devoted. And I guess to jump ahead a little bit in the story, her daughter did die early in the marriage. They had been married nearly 16 years when her daughter died, Ella. And Ella and she and the general's children were visiting in Raleigh, and he came down, of course, when his wife died. And Mrs. Swain begged him not to take the children back to Illinois, to leave them with her, and he did. For 18 months until her death, the 3 children lived with their grandmother in her home in downtown Raleigh. And he would come down Christmas, springtime, and then when she died, the children went back to Illinois.
Well, there's so much to talk about this thing. I think people would criticize me if I didn't ask you to tell the story, moving back in time, of the wedding in Chapel Hill and the complications of inviting Southern sympathizers to the wedding of a Yankee general and a daughter of the president of the university, and the reaction of the freed slaves to this event. So can you pull all of this together for us?
Yeah, and we get some of this from Cornelia Phillips Spencer's letters and journals. We get some from some newspaper articles, and then we get some from family lore. But the story goes that they sent wedding invitations for this wedding on August 23rd, 1865, and it was an evening wedding, and it was held in the Swain home, and there were some Union soldiers. There apparently were some Confederate soldiers. There were some local friends of the Swains who were going along with everything, and there were some families who did not come to the wedding, who they reportedly spit on the invitations because they were so angry about it.
Did the bad feelings that developed about this courtship and Governor Swain's or President Swain's approval of it, do we know, did those hold on in Chapel Hill? Did he have to deal with those for the rest of his life, or did they wash away with time?
They didn't wash away, and it's hard to tell how much of it was bad feelings and how much of it was Reconstruction government afterwards. The university, prior to all this happening, the state had already started looking at changing the curriculum some, and so how much of it was the wedding and how much wasn't, I'm not so sure that we'll ever know for certain, but the students were not happy with it. During the wedding, they stood in the bell tower of South building and rang the bells for 3 long hours and hung General Atkins and President Swain in effigy. Then the guests...
so yes, there
yes,
was...
they were angry.
There were really hard feelings about this.
For lingering afterwards, I guess, is how long was the lingering. But for that point, yes. And then the freedmen, the former slaves, were so jubilant over this marriage that they actually baked a wedding cake and brought it to the Swain home.
This was this is hard for us to get back in time and see all the different groups trying to figure out what was going to happen after the end of the Civil War and what the role of the freed slaves was. Well, they were, I'm sure there were a mixture of attitudes about this even among that group, but basically they were happy to be free, and here was the guy who freed them.
Yes, he was the one who they credited. He was the one who was in Chapel Hill. And it was a difficult time for them because even David Swain noted in a letter that he had freed his slaves as he was supposed to, but some had come back because they had nowhere to go. And he didn't have money to pay them, but he didn't want to turn them away. So there were all these mixed feelings at the time. But jubilant over the fact that they were freed, they baked a wedding cake, and the guests dined on this wedding cake as the bells rang in the background and the effigies hung from the bell tower, and people were adamantly opposed to the wedding. All of this took place.
Let's talk about the marriage. When I started thinking about this, I said, this is a marriage that's doomed. Different cultures, different family attitudes. This is going to be a strain. Even though in those days divorce was not as prevalent as it is now. From your story, though, this couple got along incredibly well. Is that just your positive version of it, or is that the way it really happened?
15 letters in 3 years, which I had access to, gave no indication that this was a bad marriage. It did give indications that she was very homesick, that she missed her family, that the winters in Freeport, Illinois were much, much colder than she might have anticipated when she went up there in early August with her husband. But the townspeople rallied around her as a newlywed. She and her husband eventually bought a home. She entertained neighbors and family. She seemed to like it up there. What she didn't like was the winters. And finally, what they set up was this annual trip down to the south that took place in early fall, because snow can come as early as October up there. General Atkins would bring her and the children, and after President Swain died, his mother-in-law, who had been spending the summers with them, would bring them to Raleigh. They'd spend the winter in Raleigh, where it was not quite as cold as Freeport, Illinois. Then in the spring, he would come back, pick up everybody, and take them back up to Freeport, where they'd spend the lovely summers up there.
I guess one of the indications that the marriage, or that they were deeply in love, is that so far as you could find out, General Atkins, after the early death of Ella Swain Atkins, never remarried.
No, as far as I can tell, he never remarried. There's no mention of another Mrs. Atkins. There's no grave for another Mrs. Atkins. There's no marriage license for another Mrs. Atkins. No other Mrs. Atkins is ever talked about.
The couple had a number of children. I was touched by the story of little David. And it's maybe not the most significant piece of the book, but can you tell us the story of the lost child?
Little David was the second child born. The first child died when he was just a day old. David, he was
of course named for his grandfather.
Named for his grandfather. Ella had come down to Raleigh after that first child's death to visit, discovered she was pregnant, decided to stay in Chapel Hill, gave birth to the baby here. Then General Atkins came and took his wife and baby back to Freeport. And for 14 months, this couple raised this little boy whom Ella describes in her letters as loving his papa, that General Atkins kept the crib on his side of the bed, that he made sure that the fire was lighted all night long. I mean, they truly loved this child. She talked about how he was such a good baby. And then, about the time that he would have been switching from breast milk to cow's milk, something happened. My surmise is that he had a reaction, he got dehydrated, and he died from those effects. I don't have proof of that, but it was awful for them.
Just as with the loss of a young child for any of us.
Yes.
It's painful. So many things to talk about this book, and we haven't even scratched the surface of it. But I've got to ask you about how you did this. How did this book come to be? Now, if anybody joined us late, you're the great-great-great-granddaughter of
David Swain, great-great-granddaughter
of this couple.
Right.
Of this couple. Now, so why did you have to write this book?
Well, it's a story I grew up with. I grew up with knowing the story of Ellie Swain. We called her Ellie Swain at the time. I didn't realize until I found her letters that she went by Ella. But we grew up with the story. We heard about Mrs. Swain refusing to eat at the dinner table. We heard all of that. But not until 1991-ish, 92, did I discover some letters that she had written to her parents that told about her life with General Atkins. And the first one written right after she got up to Freeport and after her marriage. And it just felt like this was such a story that had to be told, that nobody knew the rest of the story. The story always ended with the couple spent a week in Chapel Hill after their marriage, and then they fled to the north with silver and jewelry stolen from the Southerners. Oh. That was how the story always ended. And the story didn't end that way, and I felt like I just had to tell what the rest of the story was in their life together. The research was incredible, doing the research.
Why?
Finding the letters, going back and actually looking in the family Bibles to discover these babies' births and these babies' deaths, uncovering the poem that Mrs. Swain had written for her son-in-law, going up to Freeport and visiting where they lived and seeing where he was buried, and realizing that Ella's buried in Raleigh and he's buried in Freeport. And the fact that only in death were they finally ever together, because they're buried in two different places. Just so much I learned about them that really made me feel like I knew them.
Wow. Love to hear more about the research. We'll have to postpone that for another time. You're also a teacher. You teach writing.
Yes,
and
Big Tech.
And I love to ask people who both write and teach writing what they can tell the rest of us who aspire to write, or what you have learned from teaching that really some of the the 30-second lessons that you give your students, what are some of your passions in terms of what a student really needs to know about writing?
Well, they need to know their grammar, their punctuation. Every English teacher is going to say that. But to be able to draw on their own experiences, to be able to draw on their own history. Some of the papers that we write in freshman composition are those essays where they draw on their own experiences. And so helping them go back by looking at a photograph, by remembering something that happened, write about your name, where did your name come from? Those are the kinds of...
Write about your name.
About your name, what's the history of your name? How did you get your name? Lots of students know and some students don't, and it gives an opportunity.
So a little bit of minimal research perhaps.
Yeah.
Or you find out that your parents just pulled it out of the air.
Sure, yeah. With my lit students, I asked them to go back about 4 generations and list their grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents and see if they had a Confederate soldier or a Revolutionary War soldier in their background, because a lot of them don't know it. And when they discover that they do, it opens up, yes, it opens up the world of history, and it opens up for them a pride.
Well, you've done that for us with your great book, Undaunted Heart, the true story of a Southern belle and a Yankee general, written by our guest Suzy Barile, the great-great-granddaughter of the couple that are the subject of this wonderful book. Thanks for being our guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to all of y'all for visiting with us again here on North Carolina Bookwatch. If you'll join us next time, I'll introduce you to the work of another great North Carolina writer. In the meantime, check our website, check our blog, and we'll have information about upcoming programs and information about authors that we've interviewed in the past. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Podcasts on UNCTV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.